Welcome to the fourth lecture in the Fundamentals of Business Analysis course by Seventh Morning. So far, we've covered a lot of important foundational ground. We started off by talking about business analysis in our first lecture. What is it? Who does it? What are requirements? Etc. Then we changed gears a bit and talked about the environment that BAs work in, namely about the stakeholders who are invested in our projects, and then the various life cycles of systems, projects, products, and requirements that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now we're going to be kicking off our in-depth discussion of requirements using Seventh Morning's RDM model as an outline. This lecture will cover the first phase of RDM, the form phase, where requirements are gathered and defined. The following two lectures will cover the transform and finalize phases. So let's get started with forming requirements. Let's take one more look at the definition of a requirement. I don't want to be super repetitive, but if you leave this course with only one thing, you need to know what a requirement is. Definition that's now up on the screen. Once again, it's either one, a condition or capability needed by a stakeholder to solve a problem or achieve an objective. Two, a condition or capability that must be met by the solution to satisfy some kind of contract or standard, etc., etc. Or three, a documentation of either of the two. We've already discussed this a couple of times, so I won't go into the details, but I do realize that the definition isn't enough to really give you a picture of what requirements really are. So let's get into some examples here. Okay, here's an example of a requirement on the screen, and this is a very typical format, actually. It says that the system will enable a user to do something. In this case, some stakeholder or group of stakeholders requires that the system be able to let admin users run a report of beverages sold. Okay. We don't have any information displayed here on why the stakeholder needs it, but we can assume at this point that it's to facilitate running the business in some way. This really underscores the importance of traceability of requirements, by the way. That's where we capture that rationale for the requirement. You know what? Why don't we go ahead and update what we have here with the trace info? Okay, here we go. Now we have the source of the requirement and the rationale for the requirement added. You can see that this kind of helps to tell the story, right? So we have our source, Solomon Alfson, the product manager. He needs the beverage report so he can report some kind of metrics to his management. If it seems like overkill or a waste of time to write this info down, be very careful. It's extremely common for requirements to be challenged by other stakeholders, and knowing where the requirement came from and what it's for are both crucial to being able to prioritize, schedule, and plan requirements later. And this requirement seems to fall under the first definition of the requirement that we talked about before. It conveys a capability of the system that a stakeholder, in this case, again, Solomon, the product manager, that he needs to achieve an objective. And that objective is reporting on sales metrics to his management team. Good. Okay, let's take a look at an example of the second kind of requirement from the definition. Okay, so this is interesting. We have actually the same requirement here. Solomon's admin user is still able to run the report, but the rationale is different. He needs the report to be able to complete some filing that I made up, actually, with a national regulator. Similarly, we can see that this requirement matches the second definition of requirement. It's a capability of the system to satisfy a regulation, which we can consider a type of standard. And I guess I don't need to give you any more examples for the third definition, because either this or the former one, either of these documented requirements that we've discussed meets that third definition. Let me also say right now, when capturing requirements, you do not need to pay attention to which definition the requirement meets. I'm only doing it here so you have some different examples to work with, and so you can really see that definition of requirement being used in real life. So now that we've seen an example or two, let's take an initial guess at what's good and what's bad about the requirement that we've stated. Let's look for holes in the way that they've stated it. If I were a developer, the first thing I would want to know is what the report should look like. What columns should be in the report? Do we want a list of every single beverage sales transaction, or do we just want a list of all the beverages sold with summary details? Um, Over a given time frame, that's also a bit confusing to me. Does this mean that the report has a particular time frame, say the last 12 months or last 3 months? Or does it mean that the user enters a date range and the system generates the report accordingly? Either one of these options could be a valid scenario, and there are probably others. We just need to get clarity on which one. So this all leads into our next topic, which is how do you know when a requirement is good and when it's bad?